Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, this is the 2024 edition of Linux Sucks. We have been doing this for a huge number of years. This is the 13th time I've done a Linux Sucks show. It's ridiculous that I am still doing it. Hey, Lunduke, how about you beat a dead horse? Done. You don't have to ask me twice. If there's a dead horse and someone stenciled a penguin on the side of it, I'm going to beat that dead horse, and we're going to beat it to death over and over again today. That got weird in a hurry. So this is the 13th time we're doing Linux Sucks. We did a Windows is Awesome one year, and we did a Mac OS Sucks last year. Those are kind of in the same, those are like in the series. Those are like spin-off shows, but this is the actual Linux Sucks. And there are a huge number of topics we're going to be talking about today that are very sucky. And then there's a whole bunch of other things we're going to talk about that are even suckier. But you know what we're not going to talk about? We're not going to talk about problems with drivers. We've talked about that before. You know that we had problems with drivers, and you know we have less problems with drivers now, though we still have some problems with drivers. We're not going to talk about the availability of software. If you go back to the early days of Linux sucking, you'll notice that was something we talked about a whole heck of a lot, especially with games. We're not going to be talking about games because, shoot, everyone and their cat has a Steam account. So we're not going to be talking about games. We're not going to be talking about servers. Because let's be honest, Linux rules the server space. And the only areas where Linux doesn't rule the server space, there's either free BSD or open BSD to pick up the slack. I mean, which are kind of like cousins in a way. So we're not going to be talking about servers, and we're not going to be talking about mobile. We're going to be focused on the desktop side of things because that's what we're here to talk about. Desktop Linux sucking. And now I don't use the phrase desktop Linux sucks because it's just too long, so I cut out the word desktop. But we're also not going to talk about the myriad of technical problems that I myself have had lately. It seems like every other time I'm going to use an audio breakout board or a webcam or something else, it fritzes out, whether it's on a laptop or a desktop or whatever. I'm not going to talk about that. And I'm not going to talk about how steaming ridiculously mad it makes me. No, sir. We're not going to talk about any of those things. And we're also not going to talk about this. I actually don't have any reason to be putting this in here other than I just really want to put this in front of people again. This is quite possibly the most wonderful / horrible marketing campaign ever. There's the SUSE chameleon on someone's butt. That's we're not going to talk about that though. We're not going to talk about how ridiculous this marketing campaign was, and we're not going to go all the way back to the very first Linux Sucks and talk about how I had to spend 15 minutes getting VGA out to work so that the stinking projector would put my slides up on the screen, and it was ridiculous. It took literally 15 minutes before I got VGA out working on my Linux-powered laptop so I could do Linux Sucks. The epitome of irony. It's ridiculous. We're not going to talk about that. And the last thing that we're not going to talk about. We're not going to talk about crazy market share trends. This is the market share trends over a roughly, a 10 plus year period. And it shows different Linux distributions in a roller coaster ride of ridiculousness. We're not going to talk about that. And sure, various Linux distros jockey for position every, 3 or 4 or 5 years. We're not going to talk about that today. What we are going to talk about today is the elephant in the room. We're going to address the big question, the thing that people need to be talking about because it's just so intense. We're going to talk about what the fart happened to Linux last year because it was insane. I don't know if any of you were paying attention in 2023, but oh my glorb, it went nuts. It went absolutely off the charts crazy. I can say confidently that 2023 was the most redonkadonk year in Linux ever. And that's saying something. We've had some years in Linux where literally like major high profile people murdered people. We've had, that's not even a joke. That really happened. We've had major years where we had massive shakeups and all sorts of craziness. None of them hold a candle to the pure, unadulterated insanity of 2023. It was crazy. So we're going to start there. We got a few other things to talk about. We're going to start with what the fart happened in 2023 because it was crazy. Here, I need to move a few things out of the way. There we go. Here we go. Let's start with this. And those of you who follow my various articles and shenanigans, you've seen a lot of this. But what happened to Red Hat last year? Yes, a couple of years ago, IBM came in and whoop, gobble, 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 bought Red Hat. We knew that happened. And we all had our various prognostications about what would occur. But holy heavens, in 2023, Red Hat darn near just explodinated. They started out 2023 with a whole bunch of layoffs. And now it wasn't just like management and operations people getting laid off. I mean, they were laying off Fedora people. They were laying off people who were in the trenches, like actual like project managers running Fedora stuff. It's crazy, right? Huge impact to the broader Linux landscape, to Fedora, to Red Hat Enterprise, across the map. Big layoffs. That's a big news story. And then IBM did one thing after another where they started ditching parts of their support and funding of different Linux projects. One of my favorite examples being they decided to stop supporting LibreOffice. Up until now, Red Hat actually maintained a full-time person to work on LibreOffice. A lot of people don't know that, right? This was something that Red Hat did. They had, for years and years, they said, you know what? We need to have a quality Office suite on Linux, whether it's workstations or servers or desktops or whatever. So we've got to make sure it's great. So they actually paid a full-time person to work on LibreOffice. They don't anymore. They don't support LibreOffice financially anymore. And on top of that, they decided to stop shipping LibreOffice with Red Hat Enterprise. Now, a lot of people are like, well, you know, whatever. It's a random Linux distribution. What's the big deal if they stop shipping this or that? It signals a pretty radical shift in the way they'd done things up until then. And then, you guys remember this? They decided, Red Hat, that they were not going to let people have access to the Red Hat Enterprise source code, the GPL source code that they got from upstream. Most of the source code that Red Hat ships, Red Hat did not make. Now, they do make a bit of it, but most of it, no. And they said, if you want access to that source code from us, you got to buy it. Now, I am a capitalist. I'm fine with people having subscriptions or paying for things. No problem there. But this was a radical departure from the way they used to do things. In the long ago, before Red Hat itself went public, long before IBM gobbled up Red Hat, Red Hat went around to all the free software and open source people and said, here you go. Here's a bunch of stock in Red Hat just because we love you so much. And every single thing we do, boom, we're putting the source code out for it, right? This is what they did. They just loved open source and free software so much. And now they stop funding it. They stick the source code away in a vault. And they lay off a whole bunch of their people working on the open source projects. Oh my heavens. What is going on here? It's crazy. And then it gets really weird. Now, I'm going to stop for a second here because this is important. Linux sucks. Like everything else I do, we try to keep politics in a little bubble, right? Linux sucks itself does not get political. Even if I have a political feeling, politics are over there, right? Politics stay over there, not here in Linux sucks. That said, when a company, a big Linux company, does stuff that's really political, I can't not include that in Linux Sucks. So we're going to mention it because it's crazy. But then we're going to move on. I'm not going to opine about it. I'm not going to tell you what to think about it. You could love it. You could hate it. It doesn't matter. We're going to move right on. But it has to be mentioned because it's off the walls nuts. And that is this. In December, a huge number of leaks came out of IBM, who owns Red Hat, and of Red Hat that were, let's just say, more than a little discriminatory and racist. They actually created presentations where they told people a list of adjectives that they could use to describe white people and a list of adjectives to describe black people. This is Red Hat doing this. And the list of adjectives for white people were all negative, and the list of adjectives for black people were all positive. Weird, right? That's a weird thing to do. Like, with whoever you are, personally, Lunduke is against discrimination. The Linux Sucks, while it has never needed to weigh in on such topics, is going to go ahead and weigh in a little bit. I lied. I'm going to weigh in a tiny bit. Discrimination bad. Okay. And so here Red Hat is going off the charts with quotes like, whites feed and thrive on power at the expense of other races. And they have these big presentations about it. And they actually asked their employees to take anti-white pledges, right? So you had to take a pledge saying that you were kind of against white people. Super weird. And like, thing after thing came out about this. I'll let people dig those up and read them on their own, because if I get into it too much further, this is going to get crazy political. But it was undeniably the biggest story of the year. The biggest story of the year, bar none. Huge legal ramifications, massive. It turns out that executives at Red Hat had their pay, and at IBM had their pay tied to hiring people of certain races over people of other races. It was crazy stuff. Lawsuits have been kicked up. It's nuts. It's nuts. And here's what's even crazier. I have compiled, and this has taken forever, a painstaking list of every single tech publication on Earth which has covered this critical Linux news, because Red Hat and Linux are like this. Red Hat and Linux are tight. So if something massive happens at Red Hat, it's Linux news. So I went through every single Linux and open source covering publication out there, and I found all of them that were covering this critical news. And I listed them all there. That's the entire list of all of them. Now, I got to point this out here. Because if you have the craziest, the most salacious, the most click-worthy, and the most potentially legally impactful story of the year happening in the Linux world, and no Linux outlets cover it except for one, do we actually have a Linux press anymore? I mean, this is a fair question to ask. If there's not one Linux outlet out there, not one Linux journalist who's willing to cover the biggest stories of the year, that means we don't have a Linux press anymore. We don't have one. Yes, we have outlets that are like, I saw a new release of Firefox. It is version 1575.32.8, and it adds a different spelling and a menu item. Like, okay, we have outlets that cover that. But do you care about that? Probably not. Do I care about that? Maybe sometimes. But if that's all that's getting covered, we don't have a Linux press anymore. We just don't have one. And what's crazy is, and this is nuts, there are so many Linux stories that happened in 2023, we're just about to get to them, that none of the major Linux press covered. None of them. Not the major podcasts, YouTubers, major Linux magazines and news outlets. They ignored every major story of the year. If I were to put together a list of the top 10 most impactful and crazy Linux stories of the year, 9 of them got ignored by the major Linux press. Case in point, these ones from SUSE. There are multiple stories happened in 2023 from SUSE, because 2023 was a terrible year for the world's oldest Linux company. I don't know if people know that. SUSE is the oldest Linux company that's still around and kicking. Though they've been bought and sold so many times, I don't know if you can say they're the same company, but same brand, right? In this year alone, their CEO got fired. They didn't even, it was so abrupt. They didn't even have another CEO ready. Then they lined up another CEO that they poached from Red Hat, but that CEO wasn't going to be ready for a month or two. The company did so poorly on their stock offerings because they went public on the German stock exchange that they actually had to delist themselves from the stock exchange. That's not a good thing. That's not a great thing at all. It's absolutely nuts. Now, why did a lot of this happen? Well, it turns out SUSE was making really risky deals with really risky customers. And the previous CEO was greenlighting these deals. And so many of them that were so risky that the board of directors for SUSE had to come in and create an entire office within SUSE that they called the risky deals desk. This is real. This is a real thing. And they created this risky deals desk, and all of the big deals that would come through for huge, like multi-million-dollar support contracts for SUSE Linux Enterprise and whatnot, they had to go through this desk to get analyzed, to figure out if the customers were going to pay, if this was going to be a problem for SUSE long term. Because when SUSE creates a big deal, like let's say they have a $10 million deal with a client, what happens is the big enterprise Linux company hires more engineers and support people to support that client. So they have to spend money to make money. Well, if they make these deals and they hire more people and they expand their operations and they invest in all of it, and then their client doesn't pay, SUSE is up a creek without a paddle. That was these risky deals. Well, then the CEO kept going. The previous CEO kept going and kept making more risky deals, just ignored the desk, pissed off their board of directors entirely, and got canned. That all happened in 2023. And then to really just kick the dead cat, the OpenSUSE project, which is by and large essentially owned and controlled by SUSE corporate, decided, you know what we're going to do? We're going to alienate half of our users. This is a real thing that happened. They actually went out and declared that anyone of let's say a particular political ideology representing half of the people, if you are of that political ideology, they labeled you, and I quote here on this, rotten flesh that needs to be cut out. And then they proceeded to ban people in bulk from their mailing lists, from their subreddits, from their membership platform, from everything. And they essentially alienated or kicked out half of their users, half of their contributors. Massive, massive problem, right? Why on earth would a Linux project do that? They went insane. I mean, why would you do that? Why would you do that? I don't understand. And then they're like, you know what? Everything is on fire right now. Our entire world is collapsing. The corporation that sponsors us is basically a flaming bag of dog poop on our front porch. Let's go step on it by changing our mascot. The one thing that was working well for SUSE up until that point, they're like, you know what? Forget it. Forget it. We don't like how many people like our cute little green plushy chameleon. So we're going to change it. And they didn't know what they're going to change it into. They created this poll, and it was a bunch of ugly options. But they decided the one thing that was working, they were going to destroy. Now, this all happened in 2023. That's a bad year. I mean, just one of those items would be newsworthy. But this is epically bad. CEO getting fired, massive, massive risky deals, huge concerns about the future viability of the company, delisting from the stock exchange, a mass alien. I mean, one thing after another. And that's just friggin' 2023. And then here's another thing that happened this last year. I mean, this is one thing after another. The whole year was insane. GitHub, which has millions, literally millions of Linux-related repositories on it. It is the #1 host for all Linux-related projects. Some of them are distros, some are applications and libraries and server things and JavaScript, but Linux-related or running things. The #1 place for all of them to be hosted is on GitHub. And GitHub is no longer going to be a source code repository going forward. They have announced that they're changing GitHub into an AI platform, right? Meaning that everything you do related to GitHub is artificial intelligence. The coding is artificial intelligence. Even the command line tool to put your code into GitHub is now going to be an AI-driven chatbot. That is totally a real thing. You would think, Lunduke, stop writing parodies and putting them into your Linux Sucks presentation. This is absolutely real. They announced this and previewed it, and they're rolling it out right now, like a little bit at a time. It's nuts. The website, the tools, the application, everything's becoming AI now. And that's on top of the fact that their AI for all of their coding, their Copilot AI, is taking GPL'd and BSD and MIT and Apache license code and injecting it into other people's projects under the wrong licenses, creating potentially thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, of huge license problems, of legal issues that Microsoft is going to be in because of what they're doing with GitHub. It's insane. The potential legal ramifications here for not just Microsoft and GitHub, but everyone who uses that platform going forward is off the charts. And people have talked about this, right? This is one of the few stories on my list here that some of the outlets have actually covered, but it's off the charts. Like the legal liabilities here are crazy. And none of that's the craziest stuff that's happened this year. We now have Gentoo as a binary. Hell has frozen over. Gentoo is a binary distribution now. What in the fart is going on? This happened right. Oh my heavens. They made this official announcement at the end of 2023, but they've been slowly building this up for a little while. But now Gentoo is officially a binary Linux distribution. Yes, you can get source code in Gentoo, and yes, you can compile the source code in Gentoo, but Gentoo is now a binary. The whole point of Gentoo is it's that big, hard-to-use source code only distribution that some of us make fun of, and others of us revere and then make fun of the people who won't run it. Right? This is the status quo. This is the deal we've made with each other, is that we would always have Gentoo so that we could always have the one we would make fun of. Like we can make fun of the guy because he did a stage 2 Gentoo install, and we can make fun of the other guy because he failed to do a stage 2 Gentoo install. This is the deal we made. Now Gentoo is binary. What in the frig is going on? This is insanity. Again, 2023 is nuts. And then it keeps going. This is insane. GNOME hired a shaman. Now, those of you who follow me know that I covered this news, and I was one of the only ones that did. GNOME hired a shaman. Now, a bunch of you out there are like, Lunduke, why are you discriminated against shamans? I'm not discriminating against shamans. The person they hired is not religiously a shaman, is not ethnically coming from any group of people that has shamans. She is a lady from California who, according to her own statements, felt like she was so good at fixing things like herself that she would call herself a professional shaman. She would begin to bless water and sell it online as shaman water, and then created a class where a 3-part class where you could pay her to teach you how to become a professional shaman too. The GNOME Foundation hired her as the executive director. This person now runs the GNOME Foundation. It's the biggest Linux desktop that exists right now in terms of usage, right? Like most Linux desktops use a variation on the GNOME desktop. And a professional shaman, again, I'm not making fun of any shamans out there. I'm just not. I'm not going to make fun of anyone's religion. You want to have your religion, you have your religion. And I'm sorry, but if you hire someone who decides that they are a professional shaman and holds shaman classes, not religious shaman classes, business shaman classes to teach people how to get into shaman business. Well, not being shamans, not being actual shamans, to be in the shaman business, all in quotes. If you hire someone like that, that's funny. That's crazy. In a normal year, in an average year, this would be hilarious and would be the standout story of the year. Does it really make a huge difference? Like, is their professional shaman director going to destroy GNOME? I hope not. Probably not. Maybe she'll do a great job. Maybe somehow her professional shamaniness and her shaman water will cleanse all the weirdness out of GNOME that has been infecting so much of the rest of the Linux world. See the rest of the stories that we've talked about so far. Maybe that'll be great. Maybe every Linux project should hire a shaman, or a dwarf paladin, or a dark elf rogue, or whatever D&D character they want to hire. I support them in doing that 100%, but it's weird and it's funny, and I'm not going to pretend like it's not funny. And anyone who pretends like it's not funny, or that I'm being mean for pointing out how funny it is wrong and lying. I'm moving on. Now, not all of the things that have been happening have been like crazy, like earth-shattering, weird, like crazy news or shamans or things like that. There's been some really dramatic technical shifts throughout 2023. I mean, really dramatic. Case in point with Ubuntu. Ubuntu announced this last year that they were going to go 100% snappy, and even more importantly, 100% immutable. Now, what does that really mean? Well, it means they're ditching the Debian base long term. I mean, essentially, right? So people have been used to Debian being the underlying base of Ubuntu with apt install and everything else. That's kind of going away, because Ubuntu is now going to have an immutable base, meaning it's sort of like Chrome OS that way. You get these big block updates, and then you install your applications as little container apps on top of your big block updated operating system. That's what Ubuntu is going to be like sometime this year. They announced it last year. We've been able to play around with it a bit. And here's the thing, it's totally different. Using it, the workflow, the tools you use, the commands you run, everything about it is totally different. It's a whole different thing, right? It's like when Apple shifted from Mac OS 9 to Mac OS 10. It's kind of like that. It's a totally different base. Everything is different. Was there some software compatibility? Yes. Does it somewhat have similar looks? Well, sort of, kind of, in some ways. But Ubuntu in 2024 is going to start having as optional a fully separate, immutable, snappy-only system. Now, the reason I bring this up is because this is one of the most dramatic changes that Ubuntu or almost any other Linux distribution has made in the last decade. Ubuntu has stayed more or less, despite many changes. Ubuntu is, here, I want to bring up another slide here. Wait, nope, that's the wrong slide. I'll bring up the other slide later. But despite having many changes, like different versions of their desktop environment, different init managers, and a lot of other things, they have still been at their core a fork of Debian, right? That's what they've been, and people have been used to that, and they've had massive success of that. What happens when they shift completely to an immutable, snappy container-based system? Maybe people will love it and everyone will be happy. Maybe it'll explode their user base. Maybe it'll collapse their user base. I have no idea, but it's worth pointing out because it's such an absolutely potentially catastrophic, massive change. And kudos to them for doing it, because this is a huge change, but it's still a massive change that's worth noticing. We got to keep this on our radars, because we'll talk about this again in a minute. It's a huge deal. And then there's the Linux Foundation. Over the course of 2023, two things happened with the Linux Foundation that I would like to point out. I've pointed these out over the course of the last year, and I have been almost completely alone of all tech journalists in actually even covering this. But the Linux Foundation decreased their overall spending from 3.2% going to the Linux kernel to 2% in 1 year. And in that same period of time, the Linux kernel dropped long-term kernel support. That's a really big deal. That's a huge deal. I mean, that's a mammoth deal. We're going to go into that again more in a minute, but that's a massive deal. And again, no one else is covering that. And all of these stories that I just talked about are insane. They are insane. This was all just in 2023. This is just a sample. There's more, but it's crazy. 2023 was nuts. I fail to think of a year where we had stuff that was this crazy. Sure, we'd have things where like, oh, Ubuntu has ditched the Unity desktop environment. There was literally a year where that was one of the biggest news story was that Ubuntu Canonical stopped developing the Unity desktop environment, where that was the biggest thing that happens. That would barely even make this list. That wouldn't even, I don't even think I'd have put it on there because that's, that's a big deal. But it's nowhere near as off the charts nuts as what we just saw of 2023 in Linux in just 1 year. And the craziest thing, the thing that just boggles my mind is no one wants you to know about these things. And it's not like a lot of these things are horrible. They just are. They're just huge. Where on earth are we supposed to get Linux news when the Linux news journalists that are out there are only telling us that, oh, there's a new version 1.0.52.24 update to Firefox? Like, I don't care. Why is that the only news that the Linux news stories are covering? It's either point updates, little point version updates, or regurgitated press releases. We as Linux users have nowhere we can go right now in 2024 to actually get Linux news, right? There's no one place, right? It just doesn't exist anymore. Almost all of the topics that we just talked about were swept under the rug by every single outlet except me. And that's not me saying I'm the fanciest journalist ever. No, I'm not. I'm literally not. But no one's covering these things. Why? It's crazy. So we don't have a place we can go. It used to be I made podcasts about Linux, and I knew that I could go to 10 or 15 different Linux news sources, print magazines and online magazines and podcasts and blogs and all sorts of things, and get a wide cross section of honest and comprehensive Linux news. I knew that some of them had some biases, but I knew that I could count on it. If a big story broke, I knew that I could count on those journalists to cover it and that I could then go and cover it even further. Now, I'm the only one even breaking the news. Half of those stories up there were not printed anywhere but by me. Anywhere. That's messed up. That's a problem, right? That's not a feature of the Lunduke Journal. That's not a feature of Lunduke. That's a bug. That's a bug in the rest of the Linux media world. I mean, what on earth is going on? We're in a very weird place where the news is insane and it's not being covered. Now, I know people are interested in these news topics because, again, I published them. And you know what? I didn't even publish the most published stories up there. Some of the stories I wrote about Wikipedia and other things were viewed tens of millions of times, just making every single other Linux publication look minuscule by comparison in terms of eyeballs. I know that for a fact because I know. And yet they're not covering it. And yet this news keeps happening. It's almost speeding up. It's insane, but there is a good silver lining in all this, right? There, at least we have Linus. We have Linus Torvalds to keep things sane. He hops on those mailing lists, the Linux kernel mailing list, and he lets people have it, right? He goes out there and he acts as the gatekeeper for Linux sanity. He keeps the quality of code high. He makes sure that people are submitting crazy patches to the Linux kernel are colorfully rebutted. It is glorious. So at least we still have that. Even if we don't have an actual Linux press anymore, it's dead. It's just gone. It doesn't exist. Every tech publication that claims to publish to cover Linux doesn't anymore, because if they didn't cover every single one of those stories up there, they don't cover Linux. End of story. That's just the way it is. But we have Linus, right? We have Linus, and that's going to keep things just fine. We're fine. Wait a second. How old is Linus? Let's do some math here. Linus Torvalds is 54 years old. He is 54 years old. Now, he's not close to death or anything like that. But what's the average age of retirement for a programmer? So let's look into that. It's 45 to 60, somewhere in there. Okay. Reasonable. I'll buy that. I know plenty of programmers that work well past that. And I know programmers that have retired before that. And I know lots of programmers that around age 50, they just change professions entirely. But it's 45 to 60. Linus is 54. And Linus has a lot of money. Now, he's paid over $1 million per year by the Linux Foundation. And that does not include the huge amount of stock he was given. Now, I don't know what he did with the stock, but back when, and I mentioned this earlier, when Red Hat initially went public, they gifted a huge amount of stock to a ton of open source and free software people, contributors. And Linus was one of them. And then Red Hat went public. And then the stock did amazing. And then it got bought by IBM. That initial stock is worth a lot of money. There's lots of commas and lots of zeros in that amount now. So Linus could retire at any second because he shouldn't need to work ever again, right? So if he's working, he's doing so because he wants to. So what happens when Linus retires? I mean, this is a fair question to ask because he could retire at any given moment. We're going to have a point, maybe in 2024, maybe in 2025, but I would be really surprised if Linus doesn't retire within the next 2 or 3 years. It would just be weird. Now, I would love him to stay on longer, but I don't see why he would. Now, a lot of you out there are saying, why are you even bringing this up, Lunduke? This is dumb. Linux is open source. Linux is free software. The source code is public. There's hundreds, if not thousands of contributors at any given point in time. We will be fine, right? We'll be fine. We'll be fine. There's just a problem with that. That's a conceptual thing. That's a theoretical fine. Because it's true, Linux is open source. There are hundreds, if not thousands, of contributors. But the problem is there is one organization that has the control and industry backing of Linux. One organization that controls the finances of the current gatekeepers and is likely to control the finances of the future gatekeepers. And one organization that handles the majority of the infrastructure and has the industry backing and is paid by all of the major companies out there that contributes to Linux. So the reality is there is one organization, one that controls Linux. And when Linus is out of the picture, when Linus is no longer working on Linux, there is one organization that is going to control it top to bottom, for better or worse. That may make a lot of people go, yay, and that may make a lot of people freak out. But it's worth taking a look at because this is the future that is going to be happening very soon. This year, next year, I'd be real surprised if we make it to the year after that. The Linux Foundation is that key. And they have been decreasing their focus on Linux in a big, big way every year for a while now. Here's a quick slide. I put this in some of my articles before, but this simply shows the last 3 years. 3 years of how much of the Linux Foundation revenue is put towards Linux kernel support. In 2021, that number was over 3%. In 2022, it went down a little bit. Not a huge drop, but it went down a bit. By the time 2023 rolled around, it was at 2%. It's continuing to drop. This is a small amount. And just to put this in visualization for you, here is what the Linux Foundation spends money on. That little blue slice is the Linux kernel, and that red slice is anything else, anything except for Linux, right? That is just the way it is. Now, a lot of you out there, a lot of you at home in TV land are screaming at your screens right now. You're saying, but Lunduke, you're being dishonest. They do so much for Linux, not just the kernel. A lot of their projects are for different parts of Linux. So for the different Linux desktop things, and they really contribute to, oh, really? Do they really? Well, let's look at that. Let's look at what the Linux Foundation spends their hundreds of millions of dollars on every year. Yeah, they made $250 million last year, and they did not give much of that pie over to Linux. Here's a list of some of what the Linux Foundation spends their money on. Blockchain technology, AI projects, vaccine passports, green energy projects, COVID contact tracing, seriously, medical industry analytics, farm management. I think that's cool. I think farm management stuff is neat. I don't know what it has to do with the Linux kernel. Power grid management, again, interesting. All sorts of green energy programs, and diversity and inclusion badging. Now, a lot of you are like, what the fart is a diversity and inclusion badging? Well, when you go to a conference and you can pick up a physical badge, diversity and inclusion badging is a huge number of sortable pieces so that your badges will reflect your pronoun, your gender, or whatever, right? There's like a million different things you can flip in and out there, and for diversity inclusion things. So they put a lot of their resources and money into this diversity inclusion badging initiative. Now, a lot of you are wondering, what does that have to do with Linux? What does diversity, inclusion, badging, and COVID contact tracing, along with medical industry analytics, have to do with Linux? And I'll tell you, absolutely nothing. Nothing whatsoever. It has nothing at all to do with Linux. Now, some of these things, some of them, not all of them, some of them might run on top of Linux. Some of them could run on top of Linux. Some of them do run on top of Linux. But do any of them benefit Linux? No. Do any of them promote Linux? No. Do any of them have anything to do with desktop Linux, mobile Linux, or realistically even server Linux? No. Okay. So the next time someone says, oh, but there's so much beyond the Linux kernel that the Linux Foundation does that's Linuxy, ask them about all of these things. And here's the thing. You'll notice that my bullet list right over there is full. I stopped because the bullet list didn't have any more space in it to be viewed on screen. If you want to have a real fun time, go look at their 2023 and 2022 annual reports and go through those hundreds of pages that they publish, and you will find page after page after page of stuff that is not Linux. Now, again, I like things that aren't Linux. I think farm management is neat, and I think there should be more farm management software. In fact, I like farm management simulation games. However, they are not Linux. So what the heck? And some of you out there are like, Lunduke, again, you're being dishonest. God darn it. This just represents a tiny fraction of spending. Oh, does it really? Again, let's look at this real quick. 2% goes to the Linux kernel. The rest of it goes to other things. And here it is broken down into two of the things. Here's Linux spending according to the Linux Foundation, compared to blockchain and AI spending. You'll note that AI spending is, what is that, roughly 6 times, 5.5, 6 times greater than Linux kernel spending. AI, chatbots, they spend more money, 5+ times the amount of money on the Linux kernel as on chatbots. What are they doing? It's crazy. And these are the people that are going to have full control of the Linux kernel when Linus is done. And they essentially do now. I'm sorry, but they're his boss and they pay him $1 million per year. And if someone pays you $1 million per year, you listen to them. And I'm not the only one out there noticing this. For once, hallelujah, there are other press outlets that are raising this point. Here's from the Register. With big companies around the world proudly talking about their use of open source and their large-scale adoption of Linux, the core project behind it all, the kernel itself, is under-resourced and underfunded. This is from the Register. Now, the Register won't touch the majority of stories that we've talked about here today. Why? I don't know, because they mostly don't cover Linux anymore. But even the Register, which clearly doesn't really cover Linux anymore because they don't even touch the Red Hat stuff and the SUSE stuff and none of it, they still notice this. It's obvious. It is super duper obvious. Now, hold on. Hold on for a second. Because do you want to get really mad? Do you want to get mad about all of this? Because I sure as heck do. Now, we've seen that the Linux Foundation is continuing to decrease their support for Linux. We've seen it. It's clear as day, their numbers. By the way, I've published those numbers that came from them and then sent my published information to them to ask them if they could please look it over and refute it. To date, there have been no refutations. The information is correct. So that's neat. But want to get really mad? Let's think for a minute about why that is. Why is it that the Linux Foundation is doing all that sort of thing? Well, here's one thought. Here's just one thought. I'm going to spitball for a second. Here's a chart showing you all of the people who sit on the board of the Linux Foundation. Now, the board of the Linux Foundation is a neat place. You can be on the board of the Linux Foundation if you got like $500,000 in your account for every year, something like that. You throw it over the Linux Foundation and boom, Bob's your uncle. You're on the board of directors or the board for the Linux Foundation, right? So you can vote and you can set the direction of the whole Linux Foundation. 70.6% of the board members of the Linux Foundation represent companies that violate the GPL. Does that not make your blood boil a little bit? I'm sorry, but if you're a free software person and you're seeing this, you're flipping tables over right now. That means less than a third of the companies sitting on the board of directors of the Linux Foundation don't violate the GPL. There are some good ones in there. There truly are. But there also are companies like VMware and Sony and Huawei and Fujitsu and Qualcomm and Panasonic and Microsoft and Oracle. There's a lot of companies on there that violate the GPL with great regularity. And I'm not even including the ones, because I counted when there was a couple of companies that accidentally violated the GPL. And then when they got called on it, they're like, oh, you know what? My bad. We'll fix that. There we go. Now we're in compliance. I don't count that as violating the GPL because they were trying, right? I don't count that. I only counted it when they violated the GPL. Everyone said, hey, you're violating the GPL. You have to do 1, 2, and 3, X, Y, and Z in order to not violate the GPL. And the company said, here's my middle finger. Then I flagged them as a GPL violator. Over 2/3 of them. Holy heavens. So here we are. Here we are. The Linux Foundation, as of 2023, the year of Linux insanity, makes $250 million record earnings. And despite that massive earnings, they've decreased their spending on the Linux kernel, both in terms of the percentage that they earned and in terms of the total funds. A lot of people might be like, well, yeah, sure, the percentage of money of revenue that they put towards the Linux kernel went down, but the total amount went up. No, it didn't. It went down. The total amount went down and the percentage went down. I have a calculator, so I figured that out. And I looked at the form, the 990 IRS forms. I went through everything. No, it went down, which has a real impact. Everyone is noticing that the kernel is underfunded. We have no more long-term support kernel releases. That was a thing that many distributions were actively using. Those are gone now. What's next? I don't know. Over 70% of the board members of the Linux Foundation are GPL violators, and they do a crazy focus on non-Linux business. And that's in 2023. And it's been increasing. It hasn't been decreasing. Those craziness is just blasting through the roof. And here's the thing that really boils my blood is that those funding problems extend all throughout all of open source. I want to show you a graph. I published this graph over a year ago, but I'm bringing it back in now because it's so apropos. This is a huge number. I just used apropos, by the way, which makes me fancy. This shows a whole bunch of open source and free software foundations and projects and organizations and how much funding and revenue they get. Now you see there over at the far end, you see Mozilla and the Linux Foundation and Wikimedia. They bring in hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars. Mozilla brings in over $500 million every year. The Linux Foundation is cranking it up. After this, this one shows less than 200 million, but now that's over 260 some odd million. It's up since then. Huge amounts of money, right? So let's get rid of those big ones for a second and let's focus on the smaller ones. And the reason I want to focus on this for a minute is I want you to look all the way at the far left, right? Over this way, KDE and GNOME. GNOME brought in the biggest desktop environment, the one that just hired a professional shaman to lead them into the future, makes $286,000. This was in 2021. This is when the numbers I had that I was able to grab. But $200-some thousand. KDE made even less, $230-something thousand. Think about that for a minute. The biggest two desktop environments and application suite organizations bring in $200-something thousand per year. There is almost no investment going into the Linux desktop right now. It is dropping crazy fast. Red Hat is dropping financial support across the board. It's not gone, but it's dropping fast. GNOME, the biggest desktop environment, only has $280-some odd thousand coming in per year. The Linux Foundation could literally multiply the amount of funding that both GNOME and KDE get by 10 and never notice it. They could just pull some of that money from what they throw into AI and blockchains. But instead, they fund contact tracing and AI and blockchains and green energy initiatives and medical industry management and all these other things, but not Linux, not the thing that they're supposed to be doing, not the thing that they're supposed to be spending money on. They don't do that anymore. Not at all. And this is where we're at in 2023. And I'm going to tell you something straight up right now. It sucks. It really sucks. As someone who is enthusiastic about Linux, who loves Linux, who has poured a ton into Linux over the years and promoted it and worked in marketing around Linux and worked in engineering around Linux. I love Linux. This sucks. This situation sucks. 2023 was wild and crazy and fun in a lot of ways. Come on, we got a shaman out of it. But this sucks. And anyone who claims that this isn't a really sucky situation either has money and skin in the game, or just is blind to it. I'm sorry. This is so obvious and off the charts and ridiculous. I want to touch on one other little thing, because we in the Linux world, we have a little bit of a ticking time bomb on our hands. We have something that we've constantly said for years and years that is a selling point of Linux, and we are on the verge of losing that as a selling point. Linux doesn't have viruses. I mean, it's always had viruses, but it never had enough that it's been a problem. That seems to be changing. Now, the amount of malware and Trojans, viruses, worms, all the different types of naughty bits of code that can harm our systems is always in constant flux. One year you'll have a little bit of a spike. The next year you'll oddly not have much of anything. It all kind of just depends on when naughty people decide to release things, when certain things will randomly catch on. There's a real ebb and flow to it all if you follow this part of the security industry. Well, 2022 and then leading into the first part of 2023 was an oddly high period of time for viruses on Linux. In fact, it was up by 50%. I mean, it's a big increase. Now, we had a little bit of a dip, luckily, at the end of 2023, where it looked like it wasn't quite as bad for a little bit. And now it's ramping back up here in 2024. It looks like if the trends continue to hold, we'll end 2024 with a record number of virus detection incidents and number of new Linux-related malware, whether it's server, desktop, etc. So it's on the up and up. This is a very big potential issue. Now, there are a lot of factors at play here, including some potentially good news in that some major distributions are moving to architectural designs that could limit the impact of viruses. Things such as containers and immutable distributions. What we're seeing with Ubuntu potentially becoming a fully immutable distro, if that catches on, this could have a really solid impact in mitigating the problem of an increasing number of viruses. But if it doesn't catch on, or if virus makers find a way around all the containerization effectively, we could have a real problem on our hands. I mean, we've had a number of things pop up just in the last couple of days, like this one, CVE 2023-40547. This was basically a little root shim system that came out. A very easy and simple, potentially even remote exploit. But this is just one example. Code will be updated and fix this one. This is not the end of the world, but there's more of them coming. So the Linux virus problem is getting measurably worse right now. Will enough people move to systems that are harder to get impacted by those viruses over the course of the next year or 2 years to mitigate that? Or are we in a situation where the viruses are just going to balloon out of control, and then we can no longer say, I don't have to worry about viruses, I run Linux, because that's already kind of not becoming the case. It's a concern. I want to put it out there. It's a viable concern, and honestly, it gives kudos to Canonical and Ubuntu, which I don't like doing, but it does, that they're going in a way that might mitigate that. So there is that happening. All right. With all those news things out of the way, I want to talk about the state of the distributions in 2023. Just a couple of them, because all of the news stories that we talked about, among others, has a pretty dramatic impact on the Linux distributions, the community ones that we use every day. Most notably, Fedora. What happens with Fedora going forward? Red Hat has already killed CentOS, right? They killed CentOS a couple of years back. They've axed a whole bunch of their funding for open source projects that impact Fedora, like LibreOffice. They've laid off key Fedora employees. They're restricting Red Hat Enterprise Linux source code, which, I mean, come on, Fedora and Red Hat Enterprise Linux, not the same, but pretty deep interwoviness. What happens to Fedora over the rest of this year? It's a fair question to ask. And if I worked at Red Hat right now and I worked primarily on Fedora, I would be concerned. The writing seems to be on the wall that we might not have Fedora in its current incarnation for much longer. I'm just putting that out there. I think that's ridiculous too. But that seems to be the direction that Red Hat and IBM are going with Linux right now. Ubuntu doesn't have all that chaos going on, but they are fundamentally changing their whole architecture. They're going from Debian and apt to an immutable system with Snappy. That's a massive change to spring on end users. That's a massive change for their engineers and release people and their testers. How well is that going to go? What is the quality going to be like? What is the release schedule going to be like? What are people going to, how are they going to respond? I mean, maybe people will love it. Maybe people will hate it. We don't know, but it puts the future of Ubuntu completely into unknown territory. And the leadership of Ubuntu have to know that. Mark Shuttleworth, the head of Canonical, has to know he's taking a gamble. He's rolling the dice and saying, this is the future. We've got to go for it, even if it means potentially Ubuntu could crash and burn because of it. It's a potential thing here. Kudos to them for taking that effort. I'm going to be honest, I'm not 100% sold on immutability or snappy, but kudos to them for going for it. I mean, I want to list out, I showed this slide last year in Linux Sucks. This is a list of some of the things that Canonical has killed. Unity, Upstart, Mir, Ubuntu Touch, Ubuntu for Android, Ubuntu for TV, hopes and dreams, and then Snap will probably be next. They kill off projects like Google does, right? So the reality is, if it doesn't work, if the reception is bad and they say, we don't like this snappy immutable thing, Ubuntu could go right back to the Debian ways. And maybe that would be fine. But kudos to them for trying. And kudos to Canonical for trying all of these things. Some of them were ill-fated from the start. Some of them were ill-informed. I advised against some of these. But kudos to them for trying. They tried to do something unique and different, and I think that's pretty rad. I think that's rad. There's some cool things happening in the Linux world, and I think this is one of them. OpenSUSE, the same thing that's going on over at Red Hat, but for entirely different reasons. Massive turmoil and uncertainty. The parent company SUSE, we saw, I mean, crazy implosions, crazy off the charts implosions, and then the project, the leadership of it, gets rid of basically half their users and half their contributors, basically goes to war against people. And then I didn't even mention this before, but they were struggling to simply find people willing to run for election to their board of directors. Now, I used to sit on the board of directors of OpenSUSE, right? So I know how all this works. The election cycle happens every 2 years. The election cycle came up and boom, they were like, hey, who wants to run for the board of OpenSUSE? We've got 3 open positions. Anybody? What are those crickets I hear? They managed to eventually convince 3 people to do it, which meant nobody ran unopposed, and that was that. They had a hard time finding people simply to sit on their board of directors. It's not looking good for OpenSUSE. Elementary. I used to, in Linux Sucks, talk about how Elementary was coming out of nowhere and was destined for greatness, and its market share was shooting through the roof. They had multiple employees at one point. The future looked so bright. Now they are down to 1 employee, and that 1 employee, one of their founders, says that he might take some time off from Linux. I mean, that's terrible. I mean, that's sad for any Elementary person out there, but that's what's happening with Elementary. And then Gentoo. Hold on a second. Where's my Gentoo slide? There's my Gentoo slide. Gentoo is now a binary distribution. What is that? What is going on here? I mean, I don't even know what to make of that. Maybe that's great. Maybe that's horrible. Maybe that's the second coming. Maybe that's the sign of the apocalypse. There's the 4 horsemen, and the 4th horseman is Gentoo being a binary distribution. I don't know. It's crazy though, and it means uncertainty. It means we're going from a year of craziness, of unparalleled, earth-shattering craziness, into more uncertainty. I want to mention Pop! OS, another distribution that's doing interesting things. This is the System 76 people who make hardware, right? But they have their own OS now. It used to be that they shipped Ubuntu, but instead they call it Pop! OS. And until now, it was just kind of a reskinned Ubuntu with a few extra bells and whistles. Now they're developing their entire brand new from scratch desktop environment, along with a full suite of applications to go along with it. Brand new from scratch, right? This is major changes, and they're going to ship all their hardware with it. Major changes and a massive investment from a historically Ubuntu-focused hardware company. What impact is that going to have on the System 76 users, on Pop! OS users, on Ubuntu users? Unknown. Unknown, but it's massive. Is it going to fail? Is it going to succeed massively? Unknown, but it's interesting. It's exciting, and it's crazy and tumultuous. And then there's Debian, which seems fine. Debian's doing just fine. Nothing really crazy is happening with Debian right now, and I like that. I'm running Debian right now on this machine. I'm running Debian on that machine, and I'm hoping that Debian just stays fine. Just stay fine, Debian. Just stay Debian. Please, Debian, don't stop being Debian. I implore you, please be Debian for the foreseeable future. I need that. I need that in my life. So let's recap a little bit about 2023. Because 2023 for Linux was insane. It was, I think, without question, the most insane year that Linux ever had. And Linux organizations, Linux companies, Linux projects, Linux foundations are pretending like everything is normal, which I don't blame them for, because it's insanity. If you were in SUSE or Red Hat's position, would you be coming out and issuing press releases and declaring that my hair is on fire? My hair? No, their hair is on fire, but they're not going to issue press releases about that. I don't blame them for that. I don't blame the PR people or the marketing people behind all these projects and foundations about coming out. Are you going to see the Linux Foundation issue a press release that says, we've just dropped our spending on Linux kernel even further, but now we have COVID contact tracing? Like, no, of course they're not going to tout that as the future. They're going to downplay all of this craziness. They're going to downplay it. In fact, GNOME, you saw this. When they hired their professional shaman, they downplayed it. They banned anyone who mentioned the word shaman. They banned me from going to their live events. They banned me from going to their forum to ask questions, no matter what, because I used the word shaman. They banned every single user. People were sending me screenshots regularly for several days of, I asked a question, but because I asked a question about that included the word shaman, even if it was respectful, the GNOME Foundation banned it. These foundations and organizations and companies are going censor happy and damping everything down, and they're pretending like everything is as normal as possible, even though it's wackadoodle. But the thing that's real crazy is that none of the Linux journalists covered this insanity. And there's more than this too. But this is some of the big stuff, and they didn't cover hardly any of it. So where are you supposed to get your Linux news? There's not really a whole lot of options. I mean, you've got me over here, but I can't be the only one in town. It's nuts. It's almost more crazy that it's not covered, because all those stories up there, salacious. Oh my gosh, those stories about SUSE, those stories about Red Hat, the GNOME shaman, those are clickbait heaven. If you're a journalist or an editor, you're like, oh man, this article is gonna get some clicks. And you know what? I thought the same thing. And you know what? I got those clicks. They didn't get those clicks. And by they, I mean any of the other tech journalists, any of the Linux covering journalists, the Linux podcasters, the Linux YouTubers. They didn't cover any of this. I'm really curious to see what's going to happen in 2024. Because if 2024 is anything like 2023, it's going to make our heads explode. It's going to be nuts. It's going to be absolutely off the wall crazy. I mean, what could happen? I mean, what really could happen to have 2024 top 2023? What will happen to the major distributions? I mean, because massive technological and just riotously chaotic changes happened this last year. Will that happen again this year? It almost seems impossible that it could, but it almost seems impossible that it won't. What will happen to the Linux companies? Well, already disaster is set up for multiple. I mean, I don't see how Red Hat comes out of this current year without more disaster. We're going to find out, though. And what will happen to the Linux Foundation? What will they do? Will they reduce their spending further? Will Linus retire? Will they create a project where they fund a series of hot dog stands across the country? We don't know what they're going to do. They're crazy. So when will Linus retire? I don't know. Will KDE hire a dwarf warrior or a dwarf paladin or a dark elf mage? Whatever. Like what will happen? I mean, if you'd have asked me, if you'd have said, if you'd have said, Lunduke, what's going to happen in 2023? Let's flash back like a couple of years from now and say, Lunduke, what's going to happen in 2023? I would not have said, well, the GNOME project's going to hire a shaman to lead them into the future. Red Hat's going to declare that all white people are evil and force their employees to take an anti-white person pledge. And then the Linux Foundation is going to stop funding Linux and get into farm management. I would not have come up with that. It's like people came up with a prophecy generator that just inserted random words and just like salad shootered them into 2023. That's what we got this last year. There is no way, I couldn't have predicted that. There's no way that this next year could be more insane, right? I mean, it couldn't get much worse. How will whatever happen in the coming year and whatever happened that we just dealt with impact the quality of these Linux distributions and desktops? That remains to be seen. We just don't know, but it's insane and it's chaos. And there is a good news to this, because 2023 was nuts. And if Linux can survive 2023, it can probably survive anything, right? I mean, unless 2024 ratchets is up a notch, Linux is probably going to stick around. There's only a couple of things that could go really wrong, but I think it could survive anything. It could survive this last year. If it could survive everything that happened with SUSE and Red Hat and the Linux Foundation and the GNOME Journal and everything else, if it could survive that, it's going to make it into the future. And if not, I hear OpenBSD is pretty cool. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you. This has been Linux Sucks 2024. It's going to suck more than anything has ever sucked before. Thank you for hanging out with me. Please tip your waiters and waitresses. Go to lunduke.com where you can watch all of the Linux Sucks on demand, every single one, including Mac OS Sucks and Windows is Awesome and all the other shows that I've done. And if you go to lunduke.locals.com, I'm ending at just the right time because my voice is going. You can read all the articles that I cover all of this stuff in, unlike all of the other tech journalists, looking at you, Wayne, that don't seem to cover any of this stuff. And it's just absolutely fantastic. And I want to shout out to all of the subscribers to the Lunduke Journal, because without you, I wouldn't be able to do this. I would not be able to speak truth to Linuxy power. I would not be able to say the truth on a regular basis. I would not be able to shout my opinions from the rooftops like I do. You make this possible, and I absolutely could not do it without you. You are amazing. All of you that subscribe at lunduke.locals.com, I want to high five every single one of you when I get the chance. I love you all. Now, with that, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, nerds and nerdettes across the inner tubes, I do declare, end Linux Sucks. Ba-dum! That's it, right there. Bum, 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 bum. That's the end of the show. That's the end of the show. And we just ended.